All right, now we're going to implement the navigation bar. This is a little bit tricky and quite interesting. So on desktop, we have the logo on the left and the menu items on the right. And these menu items are laid out horizontally. In contrast, on mobile, we have the logo and this button, which we can call a toggler. When we click on the toggler, the menu items should appear vertically below the navigation bar. So how are we going to implement this? Well, here's the trick. In this navigation bar, we're going to have three elements: a logo, the toggler button, which is invisible on desktop, and an unordered list. So we're going to have three items in the navigation bar. Now, to lay this out horizontally, we're going to use flex in our navigation bar. Now, as you know, when we put items in a flex container, by default, they shrink so they can appear in one line. Now, on mobile, we want these menu items to appear on the second line, below the navigation bar. So how are we going to achieve this? Well, we're going to give this list a width of 100%, which means 100% of the width of its parent, which is the entire navigation bar. So this list is going to stretch. Then we're going to enable wrapping in our flex container. So this item or this unordered list will appear on the second line. Now, in terms of the behavior, this navigation bar is another collapsible component. So when we click on this button, our navigation bar expands. And if it's already expanded, it will collapse. So we're not going to write any new JavaScript code for implementing this navigation bar. We're going to reuse the existing code. This is another benefit of bottom-up or component-based approach. So back to VS Code. First, we need to add this logo file to our project. You can find this in the icons folder of the zip that I gave you at the beginning of the course. So let's add the logo. Good. Now, we're going to go to index.html. First, we're going to add a nav element and give it the class of nav for styling. Now, inside this nav, we're going to have three elements: the logo, the toggler button, and the list of items. So we're going to wrap the logo inside an anchor. So when the user clicks on it, they go to the homepage of the website. So we add an anchor, and inside this anchor, we need an image. Good. Now, for the href attribute, we're going to use a / to represent the root of the website. And for the image source, we're going to use images/logo.svg. Good. So this was our first element. Now the second element, the toggler button. For that, we need an icon. So let's pull up the template for our icons. So here we're using an icon container, but in the navigation bar, we don't need a round container. We just need the icon. So let's grab the SVG element and paste it here. Next, we're going to change the icon from WordPress to menu. And we should change the color from primary to white. Good. And now the third element, we need an unordered list. Now I want to give this element the list class that we defined earlier in the course. With this, we get rid of the bullet points and the left padding. Now, here we need a bunch of list items. Each list item should have an anchor. So I'm going to set the href just to a pound. We can always change that later. And for the label, I'm going to use hosting. Now let's duplicate this a few times. The second link is VPS. Then we have domain and finally pricing. Let's see what we get up to this point. All right, the first thing we need to address is the background color of the navigation bar. We should set it to black, and then we should enable flex so these items are laid out horizontally. So back to our style sheet, let's define a rule for our navs, and let's set the background to black. Then we're going to set display to flex, and by default, flex direction is horizontal, so great. Next, we're going to set justify content to space between. So the first and last items are pushed to the side, and the remaining space is distributed between other items. Why do we need this? Because on mobile, we want these two items to be pushed to the edges of the container. Now, for the list of items to appear on the next line, we're going to enable wrapping on our navigation bar and then give the list a width of 100%. Let's see what happens if we don't do this. So save the changes here. Now, back in the browser. So we have all these three elements on one line. We want to push this list to the second line. So back to our markup. Here's our list. I'm going to give it an extra class like nav list. We could also reuse the list class, but this would require nesting in our rule. So we would have to write a rule like nav list. That is totally fine. We're not going to have a second class in this nav, but I personally prefer to assign classes to individual elements in a component. So instead of nav list, we're going to use nav list. Good. Now we're going to give this a width of 100% and enable wrapping here. So flex wrap, we set it to wrap. Now take a look. All right, look, the list is on the second line. Now there are a few problems we need to address. The color of these links and the padding before and between these elements. So back to our markup, we're going to give these list items a class like nav item. Now, in our style sheet, we define a rule. I'm going to give these a padding of 0 and 2 rams. And with this, they're not so close to the edge of the container. Great. Now for the color, if we apply the color property here, let's say D2, D0, DB, the color doesn't get changed because links have their own colors. So we need to write a new rule and say nav item. Here we can use the direct child selector to target the anchor inside this element. And then we move this property over here. Now there's really no need to assign this element an individual class like nav link. We could certainly do that, but it's literally impossible. We're going to replace this anchor with another element. We should always have anchors on a navigation bar, right? Now take a look. Okay, good. Now I want to add a border below each item. So back to our nav item. Here we're going to set border bottom to 1 pixel solid 222, which is a really dark gray. Take a look. Okay, that looks good. Now, these items are so close to these borders. So let's apply a vertical padding as well. Let's say 0.5 rems. Now they look better. Next, we need to change the color of these links when we hover over them. So we're going to grab this rule, duplicate it, and then use the hover pseudo class selector. I'm going to change the color to FFF, pure white. And here's what we get. That looks good. Now let's apply a transition to make this look nicer. So back to this rule for our anchor. We're going to set the transition property to color, let's say 0.3 seconds. And with this, the transition is smoother. Great. Now this toggler button is currently so close to the edges of the container. So I want to apply a tiny padding here. So back to our nav, let's set the padding to 1 rem, horizontal and vertical. Here's what we get. That's nicer. Now currently this icon looks a little bit too white for my taste. So initially I want to change the opacity and make this a little bit darker. Then when we click on it and our navigation bar is expanded, I want the icon to be pure white. So back to our markup, here's the SVG element. I'm going to give this an extra class called nav _toggler. Now we define a new rule and say this nav toggler should initially have the opacity of 0.5. So it looks darker, great. Now, when the navigation bar is expanded, I want to make this brighter. So we need to add a few classes to our navigation bar to make it a collapsible component. So back to our nav element, to make this a collapsible component, we should give it an extra class that is collapsible. Good. Now, what about this navigation list? What class should we use here? Well, this list should be initially hidden and it should only appear when the user clicks on the toggler button. So this is the collapsible content. It's the content that can be expanded or collapsed, right? So here we're going to add another class, collapsible content. Let's test our implementation. So here's what we get. Don't worry about the extra space. We'll take care of that in a second. Let's just test the navigation bar. So click. Beautiful. Our JavaScript code kicked in and we could see the menu items. Let's click on it again. Good. Also, look at this beautiful animation, this beautiful transition. We implemented this earlier as part of building the collapsible component in isolation. Now, where is this extra space coming from? Well, let's inspect the navigation bar. So here's our nav element. Nothing crazy going on here. We only have a tiny padding inside this element. Now I'm going to expand this element. We have the logo. Now, if you pay close attention, you can see that the space below the logo is almost twice or 3 times the space above the logo. This has to do with how this image was exported. Unfortunately, this is not something I can fix because I don't know anything about vector-based drawing tools. So we just have to deal with it. Next, we have our toggler button. Nothing wrong here. Then we have our list. This orange area represents a margin. So look at the computer tab. We have 24 pixels of margin above and below this list. Very easy to fix. So back to the rule for our navigation list. We're going to set the margin to 0. All right, that's better. We still have some more space here. What I'm going to do is to remove the vertical padding. So we don't need the padding on the top and on the bottom because this image is large enough. So it's going to make our navigation bar tall enough. So we're going to get rid of that extra space. So back to the rule for our nav element. I'm going to change the padding to 0 for vertical and 1 rem for horizontal padding. Now, look, our navigation bar is narrower. It's better, but this button is not in the middle. Very easy to fix. Back to our navigation bar. We're going to use the align items property to align items along the secondary axis, which is in this case, the vertical axis. So we're going to set this to center. And here's what we get. We still have some more space below the logo. Unfortunately, we have to deal with it. So we're almost there. Now, when we click on this toggler, I want to make it brighter and I want to add a shadow around it. How can we implement this? Well, you know that when our navigation bar gets collapsed, here we're going to have an extra class called collapsible expanded. Now, when we're in this state, I want to apply some extra styles to nav toggler. So let's remove this. I'm going to cut this. Back to our style sheet. Let's define a new rule and say, if we have this class, the nav toggler here should be brighter. So we set the opacity to 1. Let's test this change and see what happens. So click, it becomes brighter. Great. But there's a tiny problem with this implementation. As you know, this class is something generic. It's got nothing to do with our navigation bars. So on this page, we can have other collapsible content. Now, it's very unlikely that we're going to have an element with this class in another collapsible component. So this implementation is going to work almost all the time. But I want to be more specific here. I want to make sure that this style is only applied to a navigation bar that is expanded. How can we do that? We use a double class selector. So I want to select an element that has both the nav class as well as collapsible expanded. So here we type .nav, and right after that, without a space, we type .collapsible expanded. With this, we can select an element that has both these classes, okay? So we set the opacity to 1. I also want to give this a box shadow. So box shadow, 0 and 0 for horizontal and vertical offset, 0 for blurring and making the shadow softer. I just want to spread it by 3 pixels. And for the color, I'm going to use 666. Not a good number. So let's see what happens. Here's what we get. It looks a little bit ugly because our button has round corners, but the shadow doesn't. So let's apply a border radius of 5 pixels here. Now take a look. Beautiful. Now one tiny problem is that the box shadow appears very suddenly. So we can apply a transition here. So back to the rule for nav toggler. We're going to set the transition to box shadow. Let's say 0.15 seconds. Also, I want to set the cursor to pointer so the toggler looks clickable. Take a look. All right, now we have this beautiful transition. Great. We're done with the mobile version. Now for desktop, we're going to write a media query to hide the toggler. Then for our navigation list, we're going to remove the width of 100%. We're going to set the width to auto so it will stretch enough to fit its content. With this, it will not appear on the second line. It will appear on the first line. So let's write a media query for screens that are wider than, let's say 768 pixels. So targeting tablets and wider screens. We're going to hide the nav toggler. So we set display to none. Then for our navigation list, we're going to set the width to auto. Now let's see what we get up to this point. So save. Here's what we get. Now we want to use flex here to lay these items horizontally. So back to our navigation list, we're going to set display to flex. Good. Now look, that's better. Now the font is a little bit too big. So we're going to set the font size to 1.6 rems. That's better. Now we should get rid of these borders. So in our media query, we're going to write another rule for nav items and set the border to 0. Good. So that looks pretty decent to me. Let's test it one last time. We're going to go to mobile. Great. Now we can expand or collapse this. There is just one tiny problem here. Let's refresh the page. Initially, the list is invisible. The reason you didn't see this earlier is because our navigation bar was in the expanded state. So back to our media query, this navigation list should always be visible. So earlier when we implemented the collapsible component, to make the collapsible content visible, we set two properties. Max height, we're going to set this to 100% of the height of its container, and opacity to 1. With these properties, we can show the navigation list. So take a look. All right. Here's the desktop version and here's the mobile version. Beautiful. To fix the problem with extra space below the logo, we can move the logo a few pixels down. It's kind of like a hack, but I think it's going to work. So back to our markup. Here's our logo. I'm going to give the anchor a class like nav _brand. Now back to our style sheet. Outside of our media query, we're going to write a new rule for nav brand. Here we can set transform to translate Y and push this, let's say, 3 pixels down. It's not enough. What about 5 pixels? I think that's right in the middle. Perfect. All right, we're done with this component. I know this was a very long lesson. The good news is that this was probably the hardest component to build in this course. So going forward, everything is going to be much easier. We have already built all the building blocks of this page. All we're going to do is just put them together to build our homepage. So I want to say thank you for your patience and your attention. In the next lesson, we're going to build the hero component.